morning, class. My name is Samaya Hodges, and today I will be presenting to you my poster on the Louisiana Slave Database. I want to start off by giving you guys some background information on what the Louisiana Slave Database is. Each record in this database holds information about individual slaves. Because these slaves were considered property, they subsequently were inventoried after the death of their master, when they were reported as runaways, when slaves testified in court, mortgages of slaves, reports of death, and several other listed incidents. This database includes over 100,000 records and an array of comparable information. It was designed by Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, and she created this almost entirely from original manuscript documents located in courthouses and historical archives throughout the state of Louisiana. This project was funded for 5 of the 15 years of its existence, and some records were found in archives in France, in Spain, and in Cuba. The database lists slaves under a multitude of different variables, some of which include, but are not limited to, sex, origin, name, age, year, location, birthplace, illness, etc. It is comprised of over 100,000 entries and is useful to archaeologists, historians, and students. The subsequent graphs represent just a few of those variables as it relates to slaves. The method used to read and understand the Louisiana Slave Database was to use the code book, which was downloadable along with the actual database itself, and the database lists variables under different abbreviations. The code book assists in turning those abbreviations into words and phrases that can be better understood. For example, SOWK, which is SALEZAP, would be translated by the code book as sale price of the slave. After gaining a broader understanding of code books, I then created my own. Using these code books and the Louisiana Slave Database, I used SPSS, the student version, to enter my data and design graphs to represent that individual data. I chose to measure African region, runaways, characteristics of slaves, race of slaves, and African language in percentages. Graph A shows that 30% of African slaves were from Senegambia, whereas Gold Coast had the lowest percentage, not even reaching the 5 percentile range. Graph B represents runaways. Majority of the slaves had indeed attempted to run away, according to this bar graph, and at least 5% had consorted with the runaways. As seen in graph C, black was the predominant race of slaves at more than 80%, and no other race even came close. But there were other races of slaves. Although graph D shows the character of slaves being 40% mostly good, as you can see, the larger bar in this graph shows that 40% of slaves were considered good. It also shows the second largest bar in this bar graph, which almost shows more than 30% running away or helping runaways. This graph supports my data for graph B over here, which was on runaway slaves, because it also shows that multiple slaves or majority of slaves had assisted in runaways or had run away at some point. The last graph listed, which is graph E, it shows that majority of slaves spoke a language called Binu Congo. The least spoken language was Adamawa Eastern. To conclude this graph presentation, I would like to say that the Louisiana Slave Database proves to be a great tool for historical interpretation. It is extremely helpful since it has several comparable variables, 114 fields, and a multitude of records, more than 100,000, to assist in research and creating visual aids like graphs. Ms. Hall created this database with that in mind. With each record representing an individual slave, the database was easy to read, understand, and interpret. Coupled with the code book, the Louisiana Slave Database provided for a great tool for research. The graphs help to see the comparisons and each slave and the different variables. For example, how both graph B and graph D could be used to support the data of each graph, being that they both show that most slaves run away. My references include the one that I've stated before, the Louisiana Slave Database, among a few others. I want to thank you guys for tuning in and for your time for listening to my presentation. Have a great day.